All right, we're here live with Hunter Motts and Isaiah, who's going on a beer run, but we'll be back. And let me make sure we don't have any feedback here. All right, and this is language learning. And
Can we?
oh, you know what? I completely forgot. There's that chat room. I need to send that link in, isn't there? All right, it's your buddy Travis, right? And
Can we?
oh, you know what? I completely forgot. There's that chat. Let me make sure I get that to him. But let's see. But yeah, Hunter, go ahead and tell us why
You want
you
me to kick it up?
yeah,
Yeah.
tell us why you brought us here together for this specific reason.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I've noticed in terms of the mixed martial arts community is that a lot of people are big language nerds like me, which is hardly a surprise. And one of the probably the question that I've gotten asked most on Twitter is about language learning. Either people want to learn a specific language and they want tips for that or resources or whatever it may be, or they want to talk about strategy or techniques. So I thought that it would be good to have a conversation where we just start sharing all those tips, answer any sort of questions that people may have, and also see how we can pull together the best tools that exist and then also potentially evolve better tools. And in particular, the one thing that I am really interested by is the idea of learning language families. So, Big Mike, Brian Callen's dad, has long talked about the importance of pattern recognition. And spot on. A lot of it is about pattern recognition. And it's very hard to spot a pattern when you only have one dot. Like essentially, if you're only looking at one word in one language, then it becomes this random floating fact that's not connected to anything. But the second that you have a lot of different words from a lot of different related languages, now you have multiple dots and you can start to pick out different patterns. So, for example, you might have like the verbs for to eat in the Romance language family, where you have, mangiare in Italian, manger in French, comer in Spanish. And so the point is that if you look at mangiare and manger, those two clearly have a lot in common. They have that same stem, that M-A-N-G. And then on the other hand, comer has this other stem. But, I learned a lot of these languages independently because that's how we're usually taught to think of them, is as, independent languages. And then it's as you work through learning French and Spanish and Italian that increasingly you start to connect the dots between them and start to think in terms of what is the same in any two members of that family and what is different. So, for example, in French and Italian, when they make the past tense, they use E for verbs of motion. That's not true in Spanish. So the point is that, we get caught up in these mental categories, these taxonomies of, oh, there is a language called Spanish. But that's ultimately pretty arbitrary, because what actually happened was that out of Latin, you evolved all these different dialects. And then, there's an old joke in linguistics that the difference between a language and a dialect is an army. At a certain point, a nation gets defined, borders get defined, and then you arbitrarily think that, this thing is a particular language. So, yeah, I thought that we could have a conversation about that and, just really answer any of the questions you have your thoughts. What has worked well for you? What do you wish existed in terms of resources? And
That's interesting.
about that.
It looks like we do have some people in the chat. Isn't it Brian Callen? Yeah, what's going on?
Where's
This is
Brian
like the
Callen? Who else is jerking it right now? Um, Brian is performing stand-up in Columbus right now.
oh, is Drew Sample gonna
Yeah, Drew
get it?
Sample and all of that crew is out there, but you know, we're Brian Callen's humble, faithful servants, trying to do Brian's work while he's entertaining everybody. Oh, can
All
we
right,
introduce ourselves? Joseph Campbell. So, Dustin, do you want to introduce yourself?
sure. I'm Dustin, aka the Woke Centrist. Um, I host these chats. Well, I say I co-host them because anybody can host these things, but I try to do like the organization aspect. Um, I help organize stuff with mixed mental arts, well, at least attempt to. I also produce some other ancillary content, just like book review stuff, and usually just video content. I'll help out in other aspects when needed, so video editing, audio editing, anything like that. I'm pretty like I guess I'm a all trades type of guy, but master of none. Like I know a lot of stuff, like basic stuff, but I'm not like an expert in anything. Uh, as far as what I do or did, independent game developer, kind of in that realm right now. I work like a bunch of different odd jobs with the game development, like as a hobbyist project. But yeah, what drew me to mixed mental arts is just to find balance between all the craziness that's going on around us, just to kind of meet everybody at a midpoint and get everybody talking to each other. And that is
Yeah.
me.
And I mean, I think, you know, I'm super grateful that Dustin suggested doing these because A, I didn't know that this tool existed. And it is just a way to get to know the community. Because the problem is that, you know, text-based communication, obviously, like you're missing all of those vocal facial cues. And then on top of that, you don't get to know the context of the person's life and, you know, what they do and why they think the way that they do. So this is just a really good forum to get to do that. And, you know, we also, you know, start to open the can of worms or on some different questions. But, you know, one of the questions is this about language in general? What about programming? Which is something Dustin can speak to.
Yes. So programming, well, programming is very lot. The thing about programming is we can, if anybody's interested, I can certainly bring some of our technical characters together in a future mixed mental arts chat, and we can talk about the logic of computer programming. I think it's important to speak about logic because that carries over to all systems, and I think that's something that Hunter wants to nail the head, put a nail on the head, is that there are systems inherent in language that if you learn the system, then you can extrapolate that to the different languages by using the central tenets that bind them all.
Yeah, there's a deep structure from which all of these things evolved. And, you know, the point is that if you can start to learn that, then it becomes far easier to remember things. So, for example, in the, you know, English and German share a common, you know, root language. Like they have the same sort of linguistic genetic history. So, but there were very specific shifts that happen in each language. So, for example, better in English is better, but in German it's besser. Water is water in English, but Wasser in German. So the T in English is a double S in German. But those are sort of the consistent systematic shifts. And if you can understand what those shifts are, then either you can read a word in that language and then, you know, have a quick, easy way to then be able to figure out what it would be in some other language. Or alternatively, you can very often take a crack or take a guess at what that word might be. And you're not going to bat 1,000 on that, but it gives you a little bit more flexibility in terms of being able to stumble your way through a conversation.
All right, it looks like we have a couple nice comments I think they're for you, Hunter. One says, "Looking great today, Brian. Big improvement." And damn, Brian, you look much better.
Well, that's really nice. I think it's probably, you're not really showing your face, so I think by default it's probably me. But it's certainly, it's nice to get some nice comments on the YouTube comments. So thanks, guys. But yeah, so I mean, does anybody? So in terms of people in the chat, like, what languages do you either speak or are you interested in learning? What has worked for you? What hasn't worked for you? Do you have questions? Or are there things that you're struggling with?
Also, to the people in the chat or who are watching right now, if you wish to join us in the actual Google Hangout, there is a link in our Reddit group. It should be listed under the comments section for this video if you'd like to join in and have a chat about language. Also, any Facebookers out there, it's also posted under the event page. You can also join the Hangout through the event page by clicking on the Hangout link.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, it seems that Ronan is really interested in computer languages, and he's the only one who's speaking up right now. So, so
all right.
Yeah.
Is there any concepts, Ronan, in C++ that you're having difficulty with? I'll see if I can just quickly help you with that. What is it? Is it I know a lot of people have a trouble with pointers. But we have another Hunter admirer here.
Yeah,
JJ
this is
Kill.
really flattering. But the int and the functions.
All right, so I'm pretty sure, Ronan, that you know the difference between an int and the int stands for integer. So that's just going to be a whole positive and negative numbers. As far as like the functions, the inherent functions in C++, is it the structure of the functions that you're having trouble with, or is it just remembering the functions that come with the language? And I'll let you marinate on that. And we have a question from Joseph Campbell, or it looks like a comment.
Ooh. I speak English
and Spanish.
Currently learning Korean. Joseph Campbell, what are you using for Korean? Eggbun or Talk to Me in Korean, or what resources are you using? Francesco is here to moderate. Thanks, Francesco. Isaiah is back. Isaiah, do you want to talk to us about the Chinese languages?
What do you want to know?
Well, just give us a little bit of a lay of the land about, like, so obviously, when we think of Mandarin Chinese, right, that's the official Chinese, but then there are lots and lots of local languages, right?
Yeah, well, like any language, there's local dialect.
Audio cut out there a little bit, Isaiah.
Sorry, I hit the wrong button. Like any language, there's a lot of local dialects, local usages, and this is how languages develop. The longer the distances between two language speakers, the more their language is going to diverge. It's the way that linguists tend to write and think about language is a lot like they think about normal biology as well. And that's why they have language families, just the way that they have phylogeny, or is that how you pronounce it? Phylogeny in biology. So with that in mind, Chinese is a branch of the Sino-Tibetan language group, which includes Tibetan, all the Chinese dialects. They're all said to be dialects of Chinese. In reality, they're not mutually intelligible. So, like a Cantonese speaker who has never been exposed to Mandarin cannot understand a Mandarin speaker. And like, for instance, let's say you have a Kung Fu movie DVD and you have Cantonese and Mandarin audio to go along with it. If you listen to them, the difference should be noticeable even to the untrained ear, because they are extremely different. So basically within
And just to take one thing that you just said there, right? Like, they're not mutually intelligible. So the test that's used for languages is the same as the test that's used for species, right? Like, the two things are of a different species if they can't have sex and have fertile offspring. That's the general rule. Like, how well that rule actually works in practice is problematic. But the same thing is true for languages. Essentially, if you can't have idea sex with somebody, then by speaking your own languages, then the languages are different languages. So that intelligibility, I mean, it breaks down because, for example, Norwegian and Swedish are different languages, but in practice, a Norwegian speaker can fairly easily understand a Swedish speaker.
And the same goes for Portuguese and Spanish.
Yeah.
Portuguese and Spanish are about 85%, between 75 and 85% mutually intelligible. And they're considered different languages because of the cultural importance to having separate languages for the two countries. Whereas
political
China,
importance.
That's what I mean. The cultural
and
political importance of having two separate languages for those two countries. Whereas in China, it's politically important and culturally important to have a single unified language, regardless of whether or not they're actually different languages. And this is that gets into the whole ethnic identity of China. And there's something definitely to be said about the bleed over between language and culture, because you can't really understand a language without first understanding the culture, because without the cultural context, you're not going to understand idioms, you're not going to understand proverbs, you're not going to understand colloquializations, or why things are said the way that they are, or like etymology as well. And all those things are important to understand and contextualize different languages. Somebody
and also
polyglots, by the way. I wouldn't say that, but I would say that I can speak more than one language to various degrees.
Well, and also Isaiah, just for context, Isaiah worked as a Chinese translator for a long time. So, and I just want to thank Stuart Radcliffe for bringing the Japanese in. Hajimemashite, yoroshiku onegai shimasu. And then what does he got? Minasan, genki desu ka? Yeah, genki desu. Stuart's son.
I need to learn.
Damn, Hunter knowing the kanji there.
Motherfucker.
Well, it says yuanqi. So, ironically, kanji is just the Japanese pronunciation of the words hanzi in Mandarin.
Well, and that, by the way, shows how, cultural appropriation is at work everywhere, because the Chinese had this, massively complicated character system. And then what happened is that all the people around China, because China was the big, cool, powerful culture, blindly copied that. So you find that those Chinese characters that were used in most extensively in Japanese, but as our buddy who's learning in Korean knows, they were also used. So Joseph Campbell knows that they're used in Korean too, although increasingly less. And then it was also used in Vietnamese. So you find that all of these things are like constantly, idea sex is constantly happening, and cultural borrowing is constantly happening.
What makes that super fun being a Chinese linguist is that I can read Korean and Japanese texts. Like, because prior to the Meiji Restoration, all government and high literature written in Korea and Japan were written in Chinese characters, and that classical Chinese was the lingua franca of East Asia for at least 2,000 years. So, as a Chinese linguist, it makes it really easy to port over and read like older texts.
Right, and a lingua franca is just a shared language that is used between speakers of different languages across a whole region. So, you know, in medieval Europe, it was Latin. In the modern world, in many ways, English is the lingua franca. There was the hope that Esperanto would become the lingua franca, but it never did. But yeah.
Well, talk about Esperanto. There was I think it was it Radiolab, or there was a
oh yeah,
Radiolab. I heard it on NPR about Esperanto and how Esperanto is tied to, etymologically to the Latin word for hope, and the hope was that. So the background of Esperanto, it became one of the de facto languages of the League of Nations in 1919 because it was aspired to mitigate any translational or linguistic losses between diplomats in order to prevent war from breaking out again. Did it work? Of course not. We had the Second World War and, you know, a century of war afterwards, but sometimes nerds have good ideas. Whether or not they work is up for debate.
So, you know, mixed metal arts may end up being the Esperanto of the 21st century, but
let's hope not.
Yeah. So I was actually at the Esperanto Museum in Vienna. And one of the things that I found out there was that both the Nazis and the Soviets actually made it a point to kill Esperanto speakers because they felt that they were threatening to the regimes.
Well, there's a long tradition of governments killing people based on their language, right? And a lot of that happened in China with in a lot of different cases. China has a long history of killing a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. The particular case that I'm thinking of, I think it was the Song Dynasty, but I could be mistaken. I'm not gonna go down my goddamn Chinese history because it's just a rabbit hole you don't want to fall down. But well, like in Korea, when Japan annexed Korea, there are first-hand accounts of Japanese soldiers beating Korean teachers and Korean speakers in the streets of Seoul and the streets of Pyongyang, you know. So that's some of the history to understand why Koreans are full of Han.
Yeah, for the Japanese in particular.
For the Japanese in particular.
But the other example of that is, do you guys know about the Vergonia? You ever heard of this? So this is one of those, I mean, you know, you find that these solutions are independently invented in different places. So in, you know, French is really like a fairly modern invention, right? It's very much the process that China is going through, where you take the capital of the dialect of the capital region, and then you insist that it is the language of the whole country. And then it becomes threatening to have people speaking other languages because, you know, rally around that different language and try and break away. I mean, you look at what the Catalans are doing. So much of that identity is based around language. But so there was this deliberate move to suppress languages at the earliest stage. So the French did this thing in Aquitaine and Provence, or with Provençal, all around school kids. And it was called Vergonia. And what they would do is, if you heard a child in school speaking Aquitaine or Provençal or one of these regional languages, you would make them wear a sign. And the sign would say something like, "I am an idiot because I speak Provençal." And then you had to wear that sign for the whole day until you caught one of your classmates speaking Provençal, and then you could hand the sign over. And whoever was wearing the sign at the end of the day, beaten out of them. They got caned, they got whatever it was. And the British did a similar thing with Welsh in Wales. And, you know, obviously what this does is it destroys community ties. It destroys the ability to, you know, effectively organize, and it makes speaking the language shameful, which is what Vergonia is. It means shame.
That's, yeah. You know, there was a debate in 1912 when the Chinese imperial dynasty got overthrown and replaced by the Republic of China about what the language of the nation was going to be. And they ended up deciding on Mandarin vice Cantonese, even though the provisional capital was in Guangzhou, which is in that's where the name Canton comes from. Canton is a Anglicization of the word Guangzhou, and I don't know how to pronounce it in Cantonese, so don't ask. But I'd assume that it's similar to Canton. So yeah. Like, governments oftentimes make decisions that aren't really in the best interests of the people who are speaking the language. And like, for example, like since the People's Republic of China became, you know, China, the only language in which they teach or conduct any government business or any broadcasts or any business at all, anything at all, is in Mandarin. Like, so everybody on mainland China knows Mandarin in addition to their local dialect. And that's really prevalent when you go to like a cosmopolitan city like Shanghai, where you'll have, you know, people speaking Fujianese, you'll have people speaking, you know, Sichuanese, et cetera, but they all speak Mandarin. So Mandarin is a lingua franca for China for different dialects of Chinese because they're mutually unintelligible. It's another weird thing about language. And like Arabic's another one. Modern Standard Arabic is a lingua franca for the Near East.
But it's one that people in general buy into much less. Like, people tend to speak their, you know, Darija or dialect much more. Like, they'll often, and then what you get into is, because in the UAE, for example, they're having a big problem where children aren't learning Arabic. Like, you know, Arab children can't speak Arabic because English is just what everybody uses, and it's much more useful.
Yeah.
And, you know, you find this, you know, all over the world. Increasingly, there are more and more kids like this for whom, you know, the focus is really global. And so therefore they're cut off from those cultures or those community because they can't speak the language. And then what ends up happening is that, you know, if you can't speak the language, you can't really enter the community. Like, you know, it's, I mean, even, you know, with my dad refused to speak Dutch to me as a kid because he thought it was a worthless language. And, you know, the degree to which when you then go to Holland, you're like massively isolated and can't really enter into the conversation. And, you know, that's a pattern that repeats throughout the world.
Yeah. Same thing happened to me with Spanish. Like, my grandmother spoke Spanish and didn't teach my mother. So it's a situation in which they think that they're helping you, but they're not.
Well, because they're focused on, and I think this also gets to like the functions of language. There's a general focus on the practical, like job, financial aspects of language. Like, you only need to have the things that are going to help you get paid. But the reality is that, you know, most of what language is about is identity and culture and belonging. And so you're cut off from those sources of belonging when you don't speak that language. And, you know, one of my favorite quotes of all time is, there's a Mandela quote that if you speak to a man in a language he understands, you speak to his head. If you speak to him in his language, you speak to his heart.
Yeah.
And that's
crucial.
Crucially, that's the crucial issue. But yeah, I mean, and so to that end, like, I love language learning. I wish I had more time to do it. do it as much as I can. It's always exciting to be able to go to a country and like either use a language that I know and dust it off, or even start to begin to enter a language. And I think that the whole world would be a much better place if we all were fucking around with languages and learning languages all the time.
All right, Hunter.
Yeah.
I have a comment from Stuart Ratcliffe that you guys might be able to help him out with. He says that he's been studying Japanese by himself for about a year, but the biggest challenge has been learning how to learn.
Yep. So I think that, I mean, there's like, you take a language like Japanese, there's all these different parts, right? So, there's hiragana and katakana, which are those two basic syllabaries. And that's the sort of thing that you just want to get down your hiragana and katakana as quickly as possible, because there's so much that you're just not even going to be able to really get going until you learn what essentially they're syllabaries, but the alphabet, right? Same thing with Russian. Like, you want to learn Cyrillic as quickly as possible. You want to learn how to read Arabic as quickly as possible. You want to learn to read Hebrew as quickly as possible, because otherwise you're going to spend your time dealing with Romanization, and you're going to just be so cut off from all the language. So I think that's the first thing. The next thing is, it's how you think about language. And, I think I'm a big fan of Michel Thomas, and Michel Thomas really focuses on, functional tools. So his whole thing is, like, and this works particularly well with the Indo-European languages. But if you have what he calls handles, which are verbs like I want, you need, right? Want, need, desire, ought to, whatever it may be, can, if you learn those verbs, which is a fairly small set of verbs, you can actually construct huge numbers of sentences. And this is very much what Tim Ferriss talks about with Pareto's law in language. So it's also being intentional about what you're learning and what's going to really open up possibilities to get you speaking and using it with native speakers as quickly as possible. Because if you're just studying vocab lists all day, then you're not getting to the stage where you actually get to interact with native speakers. And if you can even get to the stage where you can have very, very basic conversations at your local favorite sushi bar or whatever it may be, or you can start to have the experience of even being able to make sense of, some manga or anime that you love, then, you're going to build confidence, you're going to feel good, and then you can expand that circle. But, a lot of textbooks are not well designed for that. In fact, they do a terrible job of that because they're just sort of organized in this very linear way that isn't necessarily focused on practical, usable competency. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me.
Yeah.
I got distracted by the comments on the YouTube chat page.
Yeah.
Towards the end of that, but there was a lot of important stuff that you came out with first. First, learn the modality, essentially, and that's what you meant by with the syllabaries, right? Learn your fucking ABCs, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
To put it simply, learn your ABCs, because until you do that, you can't do anything. And then learn how to pronounce. And like with languages that aren't Chinese or pictographic, like having a phonetic way to write it out aids both in listening and in reading and speaking as well, because you can sit there and read out the syllables, right? So the acquisition of the language is a little bit quicker. And as you mentioned Tim Ferriss as well, and one of the strongest parts of, what was it, the 4-Hour Workweek, or the
Yep, I think it's the strongest part of the 4-Hour Workweek, honestly.
Where he's talking about how he learned Japanese by reading judo manuals and martial arts manuals.
Mm-hmm.
That, when I learned Chinese, that was one of the most cogent things for me, because I would just sit and watch. I would sit and watch sporting events, like not like soccer because I don't give a shit, but like weightlifting. China's huge into weightlifting. So they broadcast every weightlifting meet at the national level on CCTV5. And like they're big into auto racing and motorcycles. I like those. I watch them, you know. So things like that are really helpful for not only connecting. Once you have the dots laid out in front of you, finding something that you like can help. What's the word I'm looking for?
Motivate.
Connect the dots.
Yeah.
Connect the dots. I need to stop looking at the fucking at the YouTube comment page.
Yeah. Well, I think the other point, Stuart, that I would also say is like, what's I think super important for language learning is like people hold themselves to such unrealistic standards and unrealistic expectations when learning a foreign language, because what happens is they have a sentence in their native language in their head, and then they're like, how would I say this in that language? And they're like, oh, fuck, I don't know how to say that. And they want to be able to say it in this beautiful sort of flowing speech. But then you pay attention to how you speak your native language. And it is full of garbage. Like you're like stumbling over your words, you search for words, you stall. And one of the most helpful things I ever read was there's a book called Breaking Out of Beginner Spanish, which is really, really good. And he has a whole chapter that is designed to basically verbal tics, which is obviously a subject near and dear to my heart. But his whole point was that, he had this car when he first moved to Mexico City that like wouldn't start, and you had to like jiggle it a little bit to sort of prime the pump and get it going. And it's the same thing with speaking a foreign language. But there's a huge, huge difference between you saying, quiero una cerveza, and saying something like, quiero pues, yo no sé, puede ser una cerveza. Like, in both cases, it's the same structure, but the garbage in the middle, when it's Spanish garbage, which is the same Spanish garbage you can say again and again and again, it just sounds much more fluent. And so what that means is that now you and the person that you're speaking to are much, much more dialed into each other, and they're not being taken out of the conversation by this foreign language. The other thing I think is always super important is the willingness to like, fucking make an accent, because people often are like feel uncomfortable, like, really going for like the Spanish accent or the Japanese accent or the Russian accent or the Chinese accent. And you just got to fucking go for it and, channel your inner Brian Callen and act the hell out of the shit.
Yes, accents do bring credibility. And on that note, have you ever translated your personal English tics into the other languages?
Mm-mm.
Like you don't say like right in other languages or all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I haven't. No, I've never done that, but I probably could.
I would personalize your other languages instead of just using the average verbal tics that everybody else uses. You could use like your Hunterisms.
Yeah, that would be amazing. That'd be amazing. Yeah, and it is also interesting, like people always, that's just a brilliant idea, Dustin. Like I need to spread my horrible verbal tics to all the languages of the world. That can be like the real Esperanto, like the real lingua franca for humanity will be when everybody has the same verbal tics as me.
Yeah, on that note, because I know you were talking about Esperanto, and I know Isaiah brought up Radiolab. Have any of you two heard of the Bliss Symbolics language?
No.
Okay.
Oh, so no. I do remember that Radiolab episode where they had everything represented by basically pictograms that are universally understandable, like the man on the bathroom door.
Yeah, so it was by he was a Ukrainian Jew, Carl Bliss, but I think he changed his name when he immigrated to Charles K. Bliss. But anyway, he was a concentration camp survivor, and he saw how language was just this powerful force that brought him to the ranks of death in a work camp. So he did a lot of thinking while he was there, and when he was rescued, he wanted to change how people who are culturally far away from each other to communicate on the same terms. So one thing he did is he went to China and he started to self teach himself the just like the characters, but he didn't see the characters as a phonetic thing. Like he would look at the character and immediately it was um his translation. There was no translation. He didn't know any phonetic Chinese or spoke it, but when he saw the symbol, he knew that it meant something in his own language. So he wanted to carry that out to the entire world. And then I think if you did listen to that episode, it did get into the hands of some disabled children and some educators where they were able to teach these children who didn't have any motor skills to produce any language to communicate with their caretakers using bliss symbolics, so that even people who cannot speak can use this language.
Yeah,
It's pretty great.
yeah. Language is really fascinating. I mean, Steven Pinker wrote a whole book called The Language Instinct that I own but haven't started reading. And then Noam Chomsky's idea of basically the same thing is really interesting that I need to look into more. I know more about the cultural aspect of linguistic than the neurological aspect of linguistics.
I'd also, it's out of print, but I would also strongly recommend Robin Dunbar's book on grooming, gossip, and the origins of language.
Yeah.
Because that's also pretty fascinating. Because you think about, obviously at this stage, we've evolved these massively complex languages that can communicate, all sorts of ideas. But, how did they begin as very simple tools? And, where does that start from and why was it first used? The other thing, too, is JJ Kyo is asking about, how do you acquire phonemes? Right? So phonemes, individual sounds in a particular language. And often what you'll find when you're learning a foreign language is that there's a sound in another language that doesn't exist in your native language. So the example JJ is using is rolling your R's. And, when I learned Spanish, I did it in the shower, and you just sit around and you just go and you try and do it until you can get to r. And then once you have the R, then you can start to build from individual phoneme to syllables, and you can go ra, and then you can start to build out to full words, radio, until it's just like a scale. It's there, and it's so easy for you that you can access it anytime you want. Isaiah, you would have had to learn a lot of phonemes for Chinese that are not.
With Chinese, there are a lot of those. I think an interesting way and kind of a fun way to learn phonemes is to listen to the way that native speakers of the target language, how they speak your language, gives you a clue to how they form their mouth when they speak their own language. Right? So producing phonemes is all about how you form your mouth, and this is how linguists write phonemes out, like talk about the individual ones, like is it a palatal, is it a fricative, is it a stuff like that, is it a labial, and I would suggest doing some deep research on that if you have time. But basically, within Chinese, there was a chart that was presented, basically giving analogs in English to the phonemes themselves. So like there's the t initial in Chinese. So the t for like tai or tu is essentially the same as the ts in cats. So if you just remember that and start a word like with those two letters in your brain, when you start speaking, then it becomes a little bit more intuitive because you can put in within the context of something that you already understand. In addition,
so sometimes the sound literally just doesn't exist in your language. And
Yeah,
what Isaiah
well-
is saying is sometimes it exists, but
Yeah.
it would never exist in that place in a word.
exactly. Like there's no words in English that start with the ts like that aren't loan words.
Yep.
But as far as things that exist outside of your language, like there are other languages in which that exists. Like in Chinese, there's the yu sound, right? Which is it's a phoneme that doesn't exist in English. And it's, I forget how to describe it, but you put your tongue on your teeth and you say a u. You, and it sounds funny when you do it in your head. It's kind of hard. Like I don't know a lot of the technical stuff about learning language in the way that Hunter does, but because of the way that I learned the language, right? I went to the Defense Language Institute Foreign Language Center, which Hunter mentioned on a previous episode of Mixed Mental Arts, that when 9/11 happened, he went to the recruiting office and said, "Hey, I want to be a linguist. Send me to Monterey." But I actually went to Monterey, and it's not language learning in the same way that it's done in college or the same way that it's done in any academic situation. It's fire hose language learning. So the first day you go into class, the teachers do not speak English to you. They basically start screaming at you in their native language, and you hopefully have enough wherewithal to be like calm, steady, and curious, which is a good way to approach learning language. Calm, steady, and curious. But yeah, I just went off on a tangent there. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, the defense language, is that like how to, defend yourself against people arguing at you? It's like,
Yes, of course. No, but
that's what it sounds like. They were yelling at you, and you're like, okay, how do I defend myself with language?
exactly. No, but there are a lot of jobs that being a translator makes you appropriate for. Like
Yeah, one of the.
go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, sir.
Go ahead.
Oh,
No, you.
No,
you go
so-
ahead. I didn't want to derail anything.
there's-
Go ahead.
So we're in a point in the economy where we're a global economy, right? So any additional language skills you have amplifies whatever resume that you can put out. It doesn't matter if your job title says translator. If you work for a company that deals in China or deals in Russia, then it's going to behoove you to know the language of the major customers of your company. So that's one reason why language learning is extremely important. Not only that, it kind of evens out your worldview because, like I said before, you have to know the culture of the place where that language came up in order to understand that language to the best of your ability. And if you care about understanding things to the best of your ability, then you're going to have to learn the culture as well, because language and culture are inextricably linked. Hunter,
All right,
what are you doing?
We have Brendan Shaw.
I was texting with Michelle Perez. She was asking what is the
Creemos que es
relationship.
importante incluir a la comunidad.
Yeah, it's not. Anytime I write Spanish, I feel like I'm a dictator. Like it just sounds so much like a dictator.
Hago el
looks weird
Metal
with that
Arts
accent, Mark.
podcast con Brian Callen. Esto es un parte de la comunidad de Mixed Metal Arts.
But Brendan Schaub, fuck Brian Gallen.
I don't think that's actually Brendan Schaub. I think
Yeah,
that might be.
I'm pretty sure that's not Brendan Schaub, but it would be kind of amazing if Brendan Schaub had taken to trolling Brian.
That would be awesome if Brendan Schaub was watching Mixed Metal Arts to troll Brian Gallen.
Well, let's see. I can't tell if it's really him or not. You want me to go check it out?
If you want to,
yeah.
But keep it close hold. Don't go telling people.
No, that's not him.
Oh, you.
Oh.
No, I'm just kidding. I have no way of learning if it is or not.
Yeah.
I'm just messing.
And JJ, we would love to do live podcasts with an audience. That's something that we've talked about. And then what else was there? Now the threat is about fucking Brian Callen or something.
Anyway,
but
also
yeah,
accents in language give people trouble too.
Yeah.
Again,
in terms of
mimic the people speaking your own language.
Yeah.
I'm just not saying like actual accents. Like I'm talking about like accent marks, like
diacritics. Well, there's no diacritics in Chinese, so
yeah, there's shit tons in French, and then
lots in Japanese.
It's also like you know, I think the important thing is just to remember Kate the Great.
Hi.
So the other thing is just what those diacritical marks mean and how they're used. So you have to remember that, like, you know, these are all squiggles on a piece of paper that, you know, somebody sat around. Like Cyrillic was invented by Saint Cyril, right? There was actually a guy named Cyril, and he was like, I have to figure out how to represent all of this stuff, all these sounds, and so he made up symbols to represent that. But you'll often find that, you know, how something is used in one language is not how it's used in another language. So, for example, accents in French are used generally to mark stress, but on the other hand, you know, a lot of the accents that you'll see in, say, Norwegian or Swedish, like they'll have diacritical marks, and they actually change the sound. So this, you know, they're different diacritical marks, but, you know, marks can be used and letters can be used in different ways in different languages.
Yeah, I think for anyone learning Japanese, this is the hard part, is that there's no accents, but there are accents. They're not notated.
Yep.
So like if something's written out in like hiragana or katakana, there will be accented parts of the language, but it just takes a lot of practice and just knowing people who speak it fluently. Like I know a lot of names get butchered.
Yep.
Like the Nakamuras and the Yamazakis, but the accent there is actually not even, it's like Nakamura, and it would be Yamazaki. It wouldn't be, there's different accents. They're just not noted. That's one of the difficult things I had about learning.
Japanese. the same thing with, like in Russian, there are accents, and the accents, so depending, mark stress, and the vowels will change based on where they are in the stress sequence. So you'll see the word written and it might be all O's, right? Like gavarits. But in practice, because of where the stress is, the first O is not actually pronounced as an O. It's pronounced as a schwa, right? It's like an sound. And then Hebrew, and Arabic, you have all the letters, but none of the vowels are marked. So they not only didn't mark the fucking stress, they didn't mark the fucking vowels. And you really have to know the language pretty well to like have real fluency in reading it.
Yeah, that was one of the things I noticed from just like listening to Puerto Ricans speak Spanish, because they drop consonants when they speak Spanish. So that's something that happens in Japanese. Like they'll drop consonants, but that's some of the consonants just end up being silent depending on what word you're saying.
Yeah, Spanish is a tricky one, because Spanish is like the second most widely spoken language around the world after English, as far as countries and use as a lingua franca. Although Chinese is the #1 most spoken language because there's so many damn Chinese people. But so I find it very difficult to understand Spanish speakers who are not speaking either Castilian, like pure Castilian, or with a northern Mexican accent, just because those are what I've been exposed to. Like in academic Spanish that I've taken, it's all Spain Castilian. And then like shit that I hear when I was living in California is all from like northern Mexico or northwestern Mexico. So accents differentiate the greater spaces apart, and it's harder to understand a Puerto Rican for me than it is to understand, a Spaniard. Or it's harder for me to understand a Cuban, especially. Cubans are really hard to understand. But yeah, Spanish is very interesting.
Yeah, Puerto Ricans is just like a mile a minute and with truncated words. Like
Yeah.
Tres is just it's just like, wow. There's no estes at the. It's like, huh? Well, what is that? It's like they just drop a lot of consonants and vowels, like when they're speaking.
Well,
And even add.
Don't talk about my people that way, Dustin.
you're not Puerto Rican, dude.
No, I'm not, but my niece is. But it's funny because it's Spanish is much more dependent on slang. I feel like it's I speak Spanish, and like I can listen to a Salvadoran person speak Spanish, and I might not understand what they're saying to me. But the funny thing about it is that like I went, so I was in Spanish immersion when I went to school, and the teacher was Puerto Rican, right? So like we learned Puerto Rican Spanish, and like all the white kids learned Puerto Rican Spanish. So like my mom thought it was hilarious by 6th grade. She's like, all these white kids, they're speaking Spanish, but they're speaking Puerto Rican Spanish, and it's so strange. but yeah, I just wanted to put those 2 cents in.
Yeah, so chino instead of naranja.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also the same thing in English. Like, your typical American English speaker can't understand Glaswegian for shit. So I think that's the other thing too, is even when because just to like JJ's point in the chat, like most important thing about language learning is being willing to sound like an idiot and set realistic expectations for your language learning. Like even in English or whatever your native language is, like there are lots of people that you can't understand. So, just be okay with that is what I would say.
It looks like we got Sam Harris in the chat now.
Sam Harris and Brendan Schaub in the same chat. That's exciting.
Whoever's doing that is the ultimate troll. I just want to like give you a fucking virtual hug for that. That's fucking genius.
That means that they listen to the podcast, so I can't be mad at them.
Ronan, and then destroyed you. That's so funny.
I think it's probably Emil.
Emil Wellington.
Yeah.
Beefy. Old beef.
Emil Wilkington.
Emil Wilkington. Oh,
yep.
fucking fuck. So let's talk about curse words. That's one of the easiest ways to like onboard to a new language is learn how to curse people out in their language, because it's fun. It's always fun to learn curse words. Like before I learned anything in Spanish, I knew how to curse people out in Spanish, and I knew how to order drinks in Spanish, even though I was a child, and I knew how to hit on chicks. So it's like how to onboard onto a language.
Wait, before that, Hunter has to tell his Russian curse word story.
Oh, please.
No, this is pretty amazing. So when I took Russian, like obviously one of the first things they make you do is take a Russian name. So I, chose Boris because like obviously. And then on the first day, they made me, you have to like give your patronymic. So in Russian, you have like, so Putin, for example, is Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, which means that he's the son of Vladimir. So his father's name was Vladimir. So, or Mikhail Ivanovich Gorbachev, or whatever the fuck it is, right? So we've all put our in, my teacher's sitting there, she's grading it, and all of a sudden she like flips a page, she takes the next one, and all of a sudden she's like, she like virtually has like a heart attack in the middle of the thing because she's like, what is your father's name? And I said, Job. And she's like, oh, I hate to tell you this, but your father's name, 4 worst words in Russian. It means fucked. So what you wrote is that you are Boris, son of fucked. Mots. So the point is, she was like, we have to like change this somehow. Can we call him Job and say Jovovich? And so I was like, okay, fine, yeah, we'll do Boris Jovovich. But Yob is so there are the 4, what are called the 4 pillars of mat, or swearing in Russian. And Yob is one of them.
Nice.
Hey, so I have a question. Being like a rookie,
What would it be in Dutch? Like son of fucked. I know it's not Vander fucked, but what would it be?
Vander. That means Baron of fucked.
Yeah, it would be Nokasun, or something like that. So there's the classic Dutch, sort of phrase "noka in de coco," which is to fuck in the kitchen, and it rhymes, so they like it. But the 4 pillars of mat are chli, which means cock, pizda, which means cunt, yabat or yob, which is fucked, and then blad, which means whore. So those are sort of the 4 cornerstones of swearing in Russian.
I have one question.
Hey, so I have a question too, Dusty. But you got the official envelope, so I guess you go first.
No, well, this is a quick question. This is a quick one, because I don't know if you know a lot of German. When I was in high school, there was a German exchange student that told us that there's a lot of obscene last names in German, and she knew, like, if you were to translate someone's last name, she knew somebody that was like named like Heinrich Vaginaman or something like that. Just want to know if that was true.
Oh, hey, hold on. I'm gonna actually staple my question to this because I think so. I'm obviously like a rookie here in terms of I definitely have my white belt on in terms of language and stuff with the people in this here digital room. But I read somewhere, and I can't remember where or what it was about, but about how the invasion of Normandy in 1066 changed language in Europe, in terms of how like you have short syllable words that were Anglo-Saxon in origin, like shit and piss. Like that's why those are bad words. And like fuck is 1 syllable, fornication is multiple syllables. It's because the French won the war. And then there's like, I think I read like it was a story about how the Queen was she was like, I guess somebody complimented her on her hair, and they were like, "Oh, I love your red hair," and she had her beheaded and was like, "Nobody ever call my auburn hair red." And so I was wondering if that last name thing now that you've mentioned that, Dustin, if that's because, I mean, is that the Slavic or the Pan, whatever the hell it was that back then, that just because they're on the losing side of the war?
Well, so I think first things first, yeah, like when the Normans conquered the Anglo-Saxons, what ended up happening was like English is a very unusual language because it really is these two languages that have been fused, right? Norman French, and then really the underlying grammar is Germanic, Anglo-Saxon. But so what ends up happening is that very often there are words from both languages in English. So for example, if you look at English differentiates between the animal and the meat. So we have swine, which is pigs, which is like Schwein in German, but then we have pork, which is like porc in French. So you'll have mutton, right, which is mouton, which was the French word for sheep, right? And then we have sheep, which is, like the German. So and then, bœuf, beef, and then, cow, Kuh in German. So what happened is that those two languages merged, and then what ended up happening is that the use cases split. So very much the same thing would have happened with swear words where, the French, the sophisticated, elevated way to refer to something, and then the Germanic or Anglo-Saxon word becomes the coarse way to refer to something. So that's a thing that happens in languages.
Yeah, it reminds me too of like Hispanic last names. Like, that's what happened when the Spanish came. They basically, the Peruvian, if you want to call it Peru, that area was a very elitist society already. It was only a few thousand Incas that ruled over 1 million people. So basically the Spanish just came and they took the elite off the top and replaced it with themselves. And then, that's why you have today Spanish people with like 1 billion last names. Cause like, you just want to get back to motherfucker. Are you white? Like, are you are you European? Are you Neanderthal basically? Like we want to go back because it's a lot of how race took off in terms of giving political power or distributing political power. The whole mestizo, all that stuff. And basically, the only reason we were classifying each other as race is because we need to determine what kind of political power you had in the society.
Yep. And I mean, it becomes an easy way to identify people and classify people, right? Like it's, the old thing of, certain last names sound Jewish, right? And so it becomes a social signaling thing to, identify people as a basis for excluding them.
Or asking them for money.
Yeah. So I looked up this German last name thing, and this is just from Wikipedia because I don't know, Dustin, but the surnames of the German Jews are a special case as they were introduced later in the late 18th to early 19th century per fiat. The Prussian authorities imposed made-up and sometimes derogatory names. For instance, the name Waldlieferant, supplier, was created to ridicule Jewish timber trader. Even way more offensive expressions, Afterduft, literally anus odor, were in use. This is by no means the rule, though. On the contrary, those surnames most quickly recognized as probably Jewish in origin are distinctly poetical ones, probably as they were made up choices by the peoples themselves.
Hold on, anus what? That's a great one.
I wouldn't mind being a vaginaman. That would be, hey, that's a ladies' man right there.
The other great one like this is in Vietnam and Malawi, they'll often give their children like really horrible names because they don't want to attract the evil eye. So if you call your kid like, shit bucket, then you're not going to attract jealousy from other people.
So are there children named shit bucket?
I don't know about shit bucket in particular.
That's clearly a culture that cares way too much about what other people think.
Yeah. Oh, 50. Let's see. Yeah, there's because I remember he talked about this in Boy That Harnessed the Wind. He talks about like names in Malawi, and that they also do it in Vietnam. And then I asked some Vietnamese person, and she was like, "Yeah." But I don't. Yeah, I'll have to look it up and find out.
The names are evolving.
But anyway.
We got a lot of
Anyway,
in the chat room.
what are they asking, Dustin?
Well, we now have SJW. And SJW says, words are violent.
We
Words
also
are
have
violent.
Reed Nice Wonder. So the words are a signal of class. Yeah, they're a signal of tribal affiliation. And you find this also with languages like, for example, in the Parsi community, which is very wealthy, powerful Zoroastrians, usually in the Indian subcontinent. They all have very distinctive last names like Mystery. And so it became an easy way for each other, but then also for the surrounding population when they got jealous of this middleman minority to be able to attack them. So, yeah.
Farsi and Parsi, they're essentially the same thing, and it's the way that you say Persian in Farsi. It refers to, you could say, Indian subcontinent, but it's specifically the area of the Iranian plateau. So Persian people are Iranian people, which is the same word that we use for Aryan, which is another irony, but that's besides the point. So there's a lot of interesting stuff within that in and of itself. Like, there's a differentiation between Urdu and Hindi in that Urdu uses a Persian script to write for writing, and Hindi uses a Devanagari script, right? So the difference is purely ethnic, and Urdu is the language of the Muslim community of the Indian subcontinent, including Bangladesh and Pakistan, and Hindi is the lingua franca of India proper, right? So to go along with that, the differentiation between the two languages is purely in the script. They're completely mutually intelligible, but they're different languages because of political and religious subtext. And in most of the world, excluding America, religion is politics. And in America, religion is politics as well, but to a much lesser extent. So that's another interesting tangent. But I wanted to talk about words, language as a function of class indication, right? So even within a language, we have different registers that we use to denote who we are talking to and our relation with that person. So if I were to go on a job interview, I would talk very differently than I would speak with an individual whom I'm having a beer with casually. That is an instance of code switching, and that's an instance of using a register to indicate a social class or a social status. And it's also important to note that a class is merely a status with a couple of other things added on to it, right? So you could think of a class as a social status with capital behind it or capital not behind it, or as a status with bona fides behind it. So you could say that even a poor noble in medieval Europe had a higher class within the social structure than a peasant merchant who made a lot of money. And that's also relevant to the language, because the language that a peasant would use is going to be different than the language that a noble would use. And that's clear in throughout the world, actually, because like Hunter mentioned earlier, the discrimination of the French people who would speak in Provençal, right? But who would speak in Provençal? The peasants in France would be the Provençal speakers. And like in China, there's the same phenomenon with those who use vernacular Chinese versus those who use classical Chinese to write. And it's not so prevalent anymore after the early 19th or early 20th century. But prior to the early 20th century, unless you knew how to write and communicate fully in classical Chinese, you were considered to be an uneducated yokel. So even though it's the same language, there are different languages built within the language. It's language within a language within a language. It's linguiception. Pachacuti, where are you? I can't carry this shit all by myself, Hunter.
No, what I was going to say is the reason why I was laughing in the middle of that was because I was trying to find bad Vietnamese names, and I found this article from Australia, and it says the parents of a Vietnamese Australian man may have had a lack of foresight when they named him "Fuck that bitch." Which is pretty amazing. It's kind of the best ever. But apparently Facebook won't believe that that's his name. But like, you know, the point is that I think what those is one of those culturally rich moments that Isaiah often talks about, which is that you realize that a particular string of sounds doesn't have any inherent meaning. It's just had a certain meaning applied in English. It has a totally different set of meanings in Vietnamese. And, you know, you're going to find that all the time. Like things that really struck me, and Kate can tell me if I'm right here, but as I recall, in the Scandinavian languages, the word for marriage and poison are the same, spelled G-I-F-T. Is that right, Kate?
Yes, that is right. And the word for speed, this isn't exactly the same thing, but the word for speed is fart.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And, you know, so, I mean, all these particular, these sound sequences, it's totally arbitrary what they represent. I mean, with onomatopoeias, maybe there's like some sort of logic to why they are what they are. But even with that, you compare like onomatopoeias in different languages, how different languages represent, you know, woof woof, right? What's woof woof in Chinese, Isaiah?
Wan wan.
Yep. And
it's the same in Japanese.
Yep. And then is it what other it's, you know, it's, so the point is that, you know, the things like something is objective in inverted commas as a dog's bark, you know, different people in the same way that when words move between languages, they get changed. Like Isaiah was talking about, you know, Guangzhou becomes Canton or Hanzi becomes Kanji. You know, the same thing happens with even like the sound of a bird, right? For some reason, we think a bird says tweet, tweet, but that's certainly not what other languages think.
Yeah. Yeah. Every language takes the natural world in around them and reforms them through their own subjective experience, right? So the way that we talk about even core fundamental things within physics is different per language, right? So for example, like within Chinese, the way that you would talk about, I'm blanking. Like,
well, I was
off on a different tangent in my head, but yeah, you probably have an example right off the bat.
Yes. here's an example from Russian, right? So Russian has a thing called aspect. We divide up verbs in English based on things like tense, right? Is it happening in the present, the past, the future? Based on number, is it singular or plural? First person, second person, third person. In Russian, they have this whole other separate thing called aspect, where verbs can be imperfective or perfective. And the way that it's like all these things, when you take the language, they give you some sort of fairly simplistic explanation for beginning to make sense of this concept. Like when you learn Spanish, they teach you that subjunctive is sort of the twilight zone. It's the sort of maybe possibility space. But aspect is perfective or imperfective. So it's completed or uncompleted. So what that means is that you can communicate fairly subtle shades of meaning in Russian by whether you choose perfective or imperfective that you can't communicate in English, right? So you could say, you could say, I finished my homework, two totally different ways. And in one way, it means I finished my homework, it is completed, right? And in the other way, it means I finished my homework, but it's actually not really finished. It's still an ongoing process. So things that you can kind of register in English, but you don't have the same versatility to capture those sorts of concepts.
You mean you could have perhaps finished your homework earlier?
Exactly. The multiple modals, and like even multiple modals, that right, the might could have, that's like, so might is a modal verb, could is a modal verb. And you're using multiple modal verbs in the same sentence, which is that's not something that's possible in most dialects of English.
Yeah. It's really interesting knowing how to properly weasel your words. Because
how does that relate to sarcasm? Because I was just thinking, like, because Russians are superior trolls, and it seems like they have that built into their language, to just like, that's a very useful mechanism.
Yeah, I mean, actually, so Martin Totland, who's in LA right now, Kate and I had dinner, and one of the things we had dinner, Reed Nicewander was there as well. One of the things we talked about at dinner was sarcasm, and the way that sarcasm is used in different languages. And like Martin was saying that often think that Norwegians don't get American sarcasm, but it's actually just that he doesn't think American sarcasm is funny, because he thinks that sarcasm is specifically for really, can't remember exactly how he phrased it, but really flipping something on its head. And usually when Americans use sarcasm, they just say something untrue, and then they're like, that was sarcasm. And so, I think that in terms of Russia in particular, I think that, the sort of Ruskaya dusha, or Russian soul, right? There's this profound pessimism, and that pessimism, like, Russians are the most emo. Like, they have seen it all. Yeah, like, great, you're going to do this thing. And then their ability to undercut whatever you're saying is incredibly strong. And part of it is that, yeah, they have the ability to put in subtleties about like what's really going to, I mean, Americans are much more sort of definitive in their speech, where it's like, we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and we're going to do this. And the Russians, if you can use the imperfective, then you're essentially saying, yeah, we're going to do this, but we'll see. Is it really going to pay off?
Yeah, the thing I would add about Norwegian is it's a very like blunt language. Like they're very specific the way they say thank you. Like they're saying thank you specifically for today, for yesterday, for the last time I saw you, for this past year. And I think Americans are a lot more like slippery with what we're talking about, whereas they're very more blunt. And so sarcasm doesn't really like fit into that very well with Norwegians, I mean.
Yeah, and I mean, also part of it is what, you know, I mean, part of what we talked about with Martin was like, why does each culture have the humor that it has? And I mean, certainly, you know, nobody is more sarcastic than the British. And it's because you don't have the ability to speak directly. And so what you have to do is you have to use sarcasm to say what you really want to say in a way that sort of slips it underneath the radar.
Definitely. Oh, and the one thing
Yeah,
I
I
wanted
agree
to
with that.
share, I can't remember what the word is in Norwegian, but nipples in Norwegian literally translates to chest warts. Like that's how like specific their language is about stuff. My friend would always say that it's a miracle that anyone ever gets laid in Norway because their language is not super romantic.
No. So funny.
But they have a lot of sex.
But they have a lot of sex. Yeah, brystvorte.
That's right. Brystvort.
That's amazing. And then Isaiah, talk to us about Chinese humor.
Chinese humor? There is no Chinese humor.
Wait, hold on. I have a really good story here. I also forget where I heard it because it seems to be like the only bad side of having so much access to like podcasts and shit these days that I forget where the hell I heard it from. But it was this guy talking about how he had a meeting in China with like a big company. They were going to have a merger. He worked for a big American company, and he was going to go and basically be the sole representative for his company there and like a board of like 12 Chinese business owners. So he was trying to learn Chinese, and he's like, how do I learn Chinese? How do I learn Chinese? So he spent like days like busting his ass, and he's like, I don't even know what to start learning. And so he decided that he was just going to figure out one sentence to say and learn how to say that really well. And that's all he was going to do. But he knew it obviously had to be a kick-ass sentence, right? So what he did was, hey guys, because I guess they were on conference call, like with other people. It's like, so he learned how to say, hey guys, if you or hey guys, please laugh because I spent 5 days trying to learn Chinese and I want my bosses to think that I'm awesome. So he learned how to say that, and then he said it in the meeting, and then everyone started laughing. Right? So like that was like an interesting way, because I guess this is about learning language, right? So when you're learning language, someone as a language newbie, you know, for anyone that's listening to learn a language, how do you learn a language? Is it dependent on the language you learn? What do you learn first?
Hello, you learned that.
Yeah. Hello, world.
Yeah.
No, we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, just about like, you know, learning the.
Oh, my bad. Never mind.
Learning the. I'm sure that other people are tuning in. So yeah, we talked about learning like basically the alphabet, right? Like, because as long as you don't know the alphabet, and I think the other thing that I'm glad you brought it up, because is that like you may think that you know the alphabet in a language like Italian or say Norwegian if you're an English speaker because the letters look the same, but you don't know the alphabet. You don't know how to pronounce those sounds, and those sounds are different. And if you can learn how to sound out any word, no matter what it is, then you have the ability to access the language much more quickly. So I think that's the first key step. And then the key beyond that is really just to get speaking as quickly as possible. Also, Isaiah, what about Shangsheng?
Xiangsheng.
Shangsheng.
Xiangsheng.
Xiang. What tone is that?
Oh, Xiangsheng. So it's fourth tone and then first tone, but it's neutral. So Xiangsheng.
Oh, there it is. Shangsheng.
So Xiangsheng.
Junction.
I was being sarcastic. Like,
Yeah.
people seek humor everywhere and all times, regardless of what culture. So when I say Chinese people, there's no comedy in China, what I mean is there's no comedy in China that an English speaker would understand the context to. That said, I love Jackie Chan movies and they're hilarious because it's physical comedy, and physical comedy traverses cultural barriers. Like a dude slipping on a banana peel, regardless of where that is always funny. Always.
Best comedic movie for Jackie Chan, check out City Hunter.
Oh, that one's great. City Hunter is actually a manga. So talk about cultural appropriation.
Yeah, it is a manga.
Yeah. But so Xiangsheng is basically like Abbott and Costello. That's all it is. It's I mean, we all watch Looney Tunes, right?
Straight man and funny man, right?
Yeah, straight man, funny man. That's all it
They
is.
have that same dynamic in Japan as well. It's very popular there.
Well, and it's popular within like old school American comedy too. Like Abbott and Costello is one example, but like it's in Looney Tunes with the bulldog and the pug. That's one of my favorite skits. But like a lot of Chinese humor is pun based, because Chinese is a language where there's a discrete number of phonemes, and there's not a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? There's not a lot of wiggle room as far as meaning goes, or like wordplay in the way that we have it in English, because everything kind of rhymes in Chinese. So the way that they do wordplay in Chinese is heavily dependent on the different characters that represent the phonemes. So like, just as an example, within the word xiangsheng, like off the top of my head, I could think of at least four different words that have the same phoneme of sheng, and they all mean different things. So like you could, there's an internet slang that is a pun that's Tao Ni Ma, which is fuck your mother, but everybody just posts Tao Ni Ma is a llama, but Tao Ni Ma is fuck your mother. They may sound the same, but they're different because the characters are different and the tones are different. So shit like that is how a lot of Chinese curse words are built, and that's how a lot of Chinese idioms are built, and that's how a lot of Chinese humor is built on shit that you couldn't pick up unless you're balls deep in Chinese.
Yeah, it's really similar to Japanese humor as well. And
well, that's the East Asian cultural sphere for you.
Yeah, and I don't know about Chinese, but Japanese love their bodily functions.
Oh yeah. Everyone but Americans seem to have a lot of toilet humor.
No, I love toilet humor. It's like my favorite stuff. That's why I like Your Mom's House. Just talking about shitting and wiping their ass all day.
God. I have a discrete tolerance for that though. For shit humor.
I love
it.
I think
I agree with
and shit are the most awesome things ever. Like, you cannot not laugh at a fart. Like, it's just,
so are you saying a fart is the lingua franca of humanity?
I think it is.
Yeah, because there are people that are offended by farts, but
yeah, but that's because they have a stick up their butt and can't fart.
Or they're just not good at it.
Yeah, they're not a world-class farter.
Do you guys even know how bad methane is for the ozone layer?
Yeah, we do.
Most of the content of farts is not methane. Most of it is carbon dioxide.
Well, most of my information comes from South Park, so go fuck yourself.
South Pachacuti's a fake internet scientist, so it's all right. So
I'm putting that in my Twitter description.
Bro science.
yes. So let's talk more about language families, because when I was in LA and I was talking to Hunter, I mistakenly classified Arabic as Indo-European, and it's not, but there's a lot of stuff to go. There's a lot of political stuff to go with language family. So Hunter, you start that conversation, please.
Yeah, so languages evolve from common root ancestors in the same way that species do. So the great example is in Game of Thrones, right? There was High Valyrian somewhere in the distant past when Valyria existed, and then the empire falls apart, and suddenly you have all these city-states like Bravos, and then over time the local language evolves from High Valyrian into some other language. So that by the time of Game of Thrones, you have Braavosi, you have all these different languages. And then, the same thing is true with, so that's obviously George R. Martin stole that from Latin, right? So you had Latin, which was this language that was spoken all throughout the Roman Empire. There were local accents and local dialects, but then once the, empire falls apart, you start to evolve lots and lots and lots and lots of local languages. But share a lot of that common ancestry. So you'll notice that's why, Portuguese speakers and Spanish speakers and Italian speakers can all understand each other, because ultimately, the difference between a dialect and a language is an army. Lots of other language families, like the Semitic language family, which is Arabic, Hebrew, and then Aramaic and some others. And then there are, the Germanic language.
Those are the languages with like the.
Yeah, well, there's plenty of those sounds. So those phonemes. So Arabic has lots and lots of great phonemes, like the Ghain, which is, and the Ghain. And it has three different H's. It has a H, and then a Ch. So, all sorts of interesting sounds.
How do you pronounce guitar properly?
Qatar. And coffee is kahwa.
Yeah. So just for some context for those who are not listening, because nobody listens to MMA chats, but
dude, 17 people we're reaching, but they're like 17 connectors and game changers.
I think a lot of people watch these after the fact, though.
Oh, so I was being sarcastic, Dusty. Don't make me feel ashamed
also,
for being sarcastic.
My dreams, man.
Also, both
you're shitting on my dreams.
Sam Harris are watching this, so
yeah.
But anyway, so and then there's the Slavic language family, which is Russian, Polish, Czech, Ukrainian, lots of those languages. You referenced the Sino-Tibetan language family, which is languages like Tibetan and Chinese. And then there are a whole bunches of other ones. And then you can get into sort of much, much larger language families. So Indo-European is a super family that incorporates the Romance languages, the Germanic languages, and the Slavic languages, but does not incorporate the Semitic languages like Arabic.
I didn't realize until recently that Romance was referring to Rome.
And not fucking.
Yeah.
And not
Romance. Yeah, that's what I thought. I was like, okay, Romance languages. Those are the languages you need to know to fuck.
Well, there's definitely something to go along with that. Also, Hunter, that sound you make is probably my favorite one to edit in audio, because like I'll pull it out and I'll stick it somewhere else in the podcast just for fun.
So there you go, guys. That's an Easter egg you can look for in the podcast. Is the hidden
It's the notorious B.I.G.
But
Yeah.
But to get back to language families, right?
Families.
So I misapprehended Korean and Japanese to have a closer connection with Chinese than they actually do. So there is veracity to language family differentiation, right? But within that context, there are political aspects to language families, right? Like within the Semitic languages, they used to be known as the Semitic and Hamitic language families, which had to do with everything with the Hamitic people being farther south and being darker skinned than the Semitic speakers of Hebrew, right? So that's why it's uncommon for people to call Arabs Semites, because even though they speak a Semitic language, and Arabic and Hebrew are very, very closely related. So there's that aspect as well. And then you have the Germanic languages. Like a lot of this is from 19th century European scholars. And I hesitate to say linguists, because prior to the 20th century, there was not really a differentiation between different disciplines of scholarship. Like you have somebody like Karl Marx basically inventing sociology and also being a historian and a philosopher and an economist at the same time, in fields that weren't really extant at the time. So there was a lot of scholastic creation from the 19th century into the early 20th century. So that is one issue that we face when we talk about language families. And just like there's different political differentiation between what's a language and what's a dialect, as Hunter was mentioning earlier, the difference between a language and a dialect is an army. So you have the military aspect, like to be able to defend the difference between the Portuguese and the Spanish. And then you have the scholastic aspect, which is saying that Indo-European languages have a different value or a different this, that, or the other than, say, the steppe languages, which still haven't been classified into a agreed upon language family, because there's more grammatical similarity between Turkish and Japanese than there is grammatic similarities between Turkish and Arabic, or Turkish and Hungarian, or Turkish and any of the Romance languages. So, or Turkish and Greek for that matter. So it becomes real fuzzy when you look at these languages. Couple that with the fact that language variation, along with human genetic variation, suffers from or I shouldn't say suffers from admixture, but experiences admixture. So that's what loanwords are. So if something doesn't exist within a language, like say an automobile, right? And I'm using that specific term for a car, an automobile, that didn't exist before the early 20th century, that concept. So the word for it didn't exist before that thing existed. Just like an aeroplane didn't exist before the word for aeroplane didn't existed, right? So because of that, when you try and translate these words into different languages, you end up running into linguistic hurdles, right? So the word for car in Chinese is qi, which literally means gasoline cart, right? So it has a different subtext to it, right? And while you can translate something directly in the case of something like a car, think about something like, I don't know, gender. So Chinese doesn't have grammatical gender. There is only one pronoun in Chinese, and that's ta. Everything's ta, whether it's a dog, a desk, or a dude. Everything's ta. So, like,
It's basically everything is an it.
Yeah, everything's an it. So everything has the same pronoun. So issues like this are heavily dependent on the linguistics to understand the context of the culture in which that language arose. And like different cultures have different ideas about things, be it gender, be it race, be it, language itself. And that's something that you should always consider when you're trying to learn a language as well, is try to, and this is why I keep reiterating that language and culture are inextricably linked.
Good. I have a question for you. I don't know if this is Chomsky or what I'm referring to here, but like the idea, this is what you're talking about now, that like if you don't have a word for something, then it's a non-thought. And I think it's Chinese that like you're just saying, I see this. It's interesting because it's a complete opposite of like the gender discussion we're having here, because here we're so individualistic, and there you're so holistic that you're literally referring to yourself as an it, and basically admitting that you are a greater part of the whole, right? And so if I remember correctly, like in Chinese, you can't say I, or like the word I is different.
Well,
and so like it changes your thinking. So there's like your language changes your thinking, I guess.
Yeah, language definitely does change your thinking. Like the way that I thought about the world changed after I learned Chinese completely. And like a lot of my cultural baggage that I have coming from a Chicano background, which is not American and it's not Mexican. So there's a lot of liminal space that I occupy there. But with reference to Chinese specifically, I don't like thinking of things in that duality of atomism versus holism or individualism versus communitarianism. It's more accurate, I think, to say that the Chinese mindset is relational versus self-reliant. That is a dichotomy that is more prevalent as opposed to individualistic versus communitarian. If that makes sense. So a lot of that is reflected in the language and the culture, because a lot of the relationality within Chinese culture comes directly from Confucianism. And Confucianism is basically the underlying philosophy that ran the Chinese political system for 2,000 years. So it's inextricably linked from the language. And the whole tradition of Chinese scholarship comes from Confucianism, because the greatest virtue that a man can have is to be a learned man, and that's the highest status in Chinese society under the emperor. And the emperor, that's a whole other cultural discussion that we can talk about later. But and
to build off of that, like you think about how much time in English we spend choosing our words because of the story that we want to communicate. And essentially, there are certain stories that have taken hold in a given language. So, for example, in Korean, they use we almost all the time. Almost nobody uses I. It's all we all the time. In places that we wouldn't necessarily
Chinese,
use.
They don't even. In Chinese, they constantly drop the subject. If somebody's talking about themselves, they usually don't use the first person pronoun. They'll say this person, like formally speaking. If you're going to refer to yourself in a formal conversation, you say Bunren, which is this person. And you would refer to the person or a third person as Gairen, which is that person. I forgot.
So it's like Jack and Hagar from Game of Thrones.
Yeah. Sure. Well, that has specific relevance within the English language as well, because we have concepts like the royal we. In the past in England, when the king would refer to himself, he was always referred to himself as we, because he was the country.
Or Trump as in Trump.
Yes, Trump as in Trump. The greatest ever. The best there ever was.
Well, he does have all the bestest words.
Trump has all the best words. That's what he says.
Yep.
There is a comment in the chat. I think it's directed at Isaiah. It says he's talking about the inflection upwards at the end of a question. Is that consistent across languages? I could say no. I could give you 2 examples.
Go ahead.
British English, they'll actually do the reverse of that. So, like in regular English, like, oh, do you want some walnuts? British English would be like, do you want some walnuts? So it's like the exact opposite. And the thing is, Pacific Islanders also do that as well.
Oh yeah, I lived in Hawaii for 3 years, and I could tell you that it gets confusing.
Yeah, so they'll be like, you know, you want to go surfing, bro? Like,
oh, bro, you want to go surf? Is how you?
Yeah, they won't. Yeah, they would go it down. They'd do it down. Like, it's not always the same. So that there is some inconsistencies there.
And also in Chinese, because intonation is reserved for meaning, that means that questions are marked by ma, right?
Yep. Yeah.
So
ni hao ma. Oh, in Japanese it's ka.
Yeah.
Nani desu ka?
Genki desu ka? But anyway, so the you'll find that like many of the sort of like features of a language exist in lots of languages, but intonation will be used for like making something a question in English, but then intonation is used for meaning in Chinese, or a different intonation is used for questions like in you know, Hawaiian or British English.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the other question that was in here was Francesco was asking, under which category does the Basque language fall under?
It's a language orphan.
It is an isolate. It has no other family members, which is very sad for Basque.
Well, why is it? Well, how did that come to pass that it never passed on or anything, and it never like inherited anything? Is that the way it works?
Well, what happens is that these languages spread out, and then essentially Basque was that region of the world was engulfed by the Roman Empire. So it is essentially all of that territory was taken over by Latin. Why did the Basque language survive? Because it's a mountainous, rugged area, isolated area where that culture could persist over time. So there are language isolates, and usually I think the geography is such that that's why they were able to maintain that. Like if you look at, you know, what other language isolates are there? Because Hungarian and Finnish are related, but with Hungarian and Finnish, you have these 2 languages that are related with nothing in between them, these huge distances, and it's because, and then all these conquering armies swept across and essentially separated out those 2 little islands.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I think I might be languaged out. Do we have anything else that we want to add?
Yeah. How do you say shit in Chinese?
Oh, there's a lot of different ways to say shit in Chinese, but it's normally fun.
Well, have you guys talked about some?
So it's like chow fun relating to shit.
Different fun.
Have you guys talked about like language learning tools, like applications or anything? I mean, have you guys tried any out, or do we even have any recommendations for that? Because it seems somewhat appropriate.
There are a bunch of resources. I was working on my French today, and there's a website that I stumbled upon called Fluent in 3 Months. That seems very interesting. And then, like every now and then, I stumble across different language learning tools, but some I take, some I don't use, some I fucking forget about.
And what's good in one language fucking sucks in another language. So you'll have these series like Teach Yourself or Colloquial, blah 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 blah, and you might find that, for example, the thing for Farsi in, like, for example, with Farsi, Little Farsi, which is by Routledge, is pretty badass. The Teach Yourself Farsi, even though a lot of the Teach Yourself series is quite good, the Teach Yourself Farsi fucking blows. So you kind of have to shop around and see what works well in one language and what doesn't, and then see what other resources are out there. And then you'll find also that somebody has taken on doing a resource in just one language. Like for Farsi, there's Chai and Conversation, which is actually a pretty good podcast.
Well, Soto, it sounds like you have a lot. I mean, those are the little things that you kind of want to, that you can't even really pay for. So maybe we can get like a page on the website with resources, and we'll do it like by language.
That's a fucking fantastic idea.
Agreed.
So that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna make a fucking language resource page on mixedmentalarts.com.
Yeah, I also had a question for Hunter. Like,
That's not the website, you fucking schmuck.
Mixedmentalarts.online.
Online.
Yeah.
Oh, fuck.
Hunter, since I know that you're pretty well versed in Romance languages, if one were to branch out to others, is there like a central fundamental core that someone should be studying that goes across all of those specific languages?
Well, what I actually really want to start doing is developing methodologies for teaching entire language families. And I've started doing that privately with some people, specifically with the Romance language families. But, I'd be down to help develop it in the Germanic and Slavic languages, and then anybody who wants to like do the same thing, I'd love that resources to exist for all language families. So what I would say is there are books. There's a book called The Grammar of Romance, but it's pretty academic and not the most useful. But that's the sort of thing that if anybody wants to workshop that, or we can try it in some MMA chats, and we can just start messing around with like having MMA chats where we tackle whole language families.
Sweet.
Do you want to do that? Does that appeal to you?
Well, let's not promise anything. We'll try to do that.
Yeah. Audience requests, community requests will help. If you really, really want that content, we can bring it to you. And if you just want to voice your opinion specifically about any of the content we do, you could always go to our Facebook group or to the Reddit community, which needs some love.
Also, make sure you tweet all your shit talk to Brian Cowan.
Yes.
Brendan Schaub already has that covered in the chat. The other thing, so Izzy A also suggested MMA chats to each other in different languages.
Podemos empezar ahorita.
Exactly.
That's a good question.
And I think that's one of my favorite things is language tables, and I think it would be amazing to start getting some people having that going on. So that would be fun. What do we think about that?
Yeah. Well, I could say that we'll try.
Yeah.
Like if we have any Chinese language speakers, I could speak to them in Chinese.
Yeah, we have in the chat, someone wants to know if learning language through music of different types is common.
That's another way that I learned Chinese.
Yep.
I got really big into Chinese punk bands.
Dude, you make so much fucking sense now, man.
Yeah. Oh my God. I'm such a weirdo. I like Chinese punk. So much of Chinese punk music is about how much communists suck. So I have a real love for them. Like anytime somebody says these people running shit suck, I'm all with them.
You have black.
one
You have black
question.
bean rage.
Say again.
Yeah, for Isaiah.
You have some black bean rage.
Yeah, black bean rage.
I'm not sure how closely you follow like the happenings in China and the music scene, but not too long ago there was a Chinese rapper who was really shitting on foreigners. Are you aware of that what rapper?
Not off the top of my head. There's 2 billion people in China, and
He's like a he's like a
sometimes things.
well-known guy, and the video went viral.
I'll find it. So I'll find it and post commentary on Mixed Musical Arts Facebook page.
I think
Ooh.
his name is a pun on Eminem of some sort. I think it's like Slim Shady or Slim. It's like Slim something.
Slim something. I'll fucking figure it out.
Hey, well, we're on music real quick. What do you guys think about Weird Al? Because like that's just an MMA shit to do, but I don't understand it musically or languagely. But clearly, like he's a good. I mean, I always think that country music and rap music is like the same music. It's just like your lowrider or your tractor, you know, your Bud Light or your
Cavassier
or whatever the fuck. But it's about the same shit.
Well, Snoop Dogg just posted a Wheeler Walker Jr. song on his Instagram. So
honor cultures.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
I love that song.
But
Fuck you, bitch.
What are you saying about Weird Al though?
Musically, I'm just wondering, like, because I don't know if this falls into language, but I feel like what he does with language is pretty unique. Like the parody aspect of it, but also that needs to be grounded in obviously musical prowess and some sort of linguistic understanding, or definitely cultural understanding.
Yeah, he's definitely like he's the South Park of music. This cultural commentary through satire and music.
Yeah, I mean, Amish Paradise is one of the greatest things ever written.
Yeah, I think there are people that are
got a 31 on Metacritic.
Yeah, they're continuing that tradition on YouTube. Like I know there's the famous rap battles of history that kind of have a similar tone as well. If you ever want to check that out, they're really funny, and they're parodies of historical people and current celebrities having rap battles against each other. So it's like Skrillex versus Mozart. It's really funny stuff.
Albert Einstein versus Stephen Hawking.
Yeah, that's a good one too. I think one of my favorite ones was I think it was Obama versus Mitt Romney, and then at the end Abraham Lincoln swoops in and just like destroys everybody lyrically.
Lyrically, of course. Dude, yeah. And what's that website called?
Oh, it's on
go to YouTube and just type in Epic Rap Battles. They have like a channel.
It's fantastic.
Let me see. Yeah,
Epic
it's
Rap
really fun.
Battles of.
Let's get those guys on the podcast. That's like a really good. I mean, I
think that's a great idea.
Yes.
Well, they're definitely not going to watch this shit. So.
Yeah, this channel's called ERB, and it's like two dudes that are really funny, really gifted at they're very gifted at writing lyrics. Like the lyrics are hilarious and
you mean
awesome.
they're really good at it. I hate it when people say gifted. It's like somebody gave you that fucking gift. Who gave you that
worked
gift?
hard at it.
Dude, you need to relax. That's the fucking Chinese punk band shit, like reverberating inside your soul. You need to fucking let that go. Relax, okay?
Let it go. Let it go. Anyway, yeah.
Well, yeah, I'm not gonna go and get into like a shonen discussion of talent versus hard work, but they're hard working, really good rappers that are hilarious.
Yeah. Yeah, I really enjoy.
But Isaiah, I agree with you. Don't fucking say gifted again, Dustin.
Yeah, fucker.
All right, they don't have a gift.
Next time you say that shit, I'm gonna take you out back and hit you with the rattan cane.
Well, it's my bad. When I was in elementary school, I was in the GATE program. Sorry about that.
Hold on, guys. We're making Hunter uncomfortable. This is getting very racist.
What? Oh shit! I feel like we just derailed ourselves here.
No, you just lost me about 20 minutes ago. Is the honest truth.
It's good. That means we got to wrap it up.
Yeah, I was trying to wrap it up about 20 minutes ago. And then we started talking about Weird Al. Weird Al will do that. Weird Al will make you pontificate.
Well, hey, I mean, look, you remember fucking Rogan and Brian's first podcast? They had snowflakes. So I think, bad topic beats snowflakes any day.
Yeah, that is true. So Patrick Cootie dropped off. Dustin.
All right, I'll take this to the close.
Yeah,
thank you,
in your best baritone.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us here at Mixed Mental Arts Chats. Make sure to like and subscribe this video and tell your friends about it. You could also get more information about when these are scheduled and what our topics are at our Facebook group or Reddit at r/mixedmentalarts. And please, please, please tell your friends about us. Share us on Facebook. Share us on Twitter. And good night, and hope you join us next week.
And subscribe to the podcast and go to the website at mixedmentalarts.online and give us money on Patreon because we need it.
Yes. Help us grow. And also get rid of your cognitive dissonance.
And spread wokeness.
Spread wokeness through cognitive coitus.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's brain fuck the world.
Into awakeness?
Into wokeness. Not awakeness. Wokeness.
Oh shit. I'm not woke as fuck yet. I mean, but
we're not waking up. We're not waking up. We are woke.
Oh, we already got there? That's exciting.
Yeah, we're woke already. We're not waking up as someone else is doing. We're already there.
Yeah. Somebody who's watching this video right now in the comments thread.
As is Brendan Schaub and SJW.
And on that, end it, Dustin, now before we turn into pumpkins.
All right. Thank you for watching. Good night.